Hello, everyone, and welcome to another The Politics of Self Hangout. So with me, I have Joe Koo from Portland,
California.
California. I'm sorry, Joe Koo. And my name is Joanna, and I'm from London. So we're going to have Kelly joining us shortly, and I will pass on to Joe so he will introduce the topic for today's Hangout. In the meantime, you're always welcome to send us your questions. So just use the Q&A box on the right side of your screen, and we'll address it during our session. Over to you, Joe.
All right, so today we're going to talk about something that might sound a little intimidating for those who saw the word Karl Marx and false consciousness. Whoa, what is all of that? So we're going to break that down. I'm going to introduce the main ideas about that, and we're going to talk about how that is relevant to each and every one of us in our daily lives, and how it's not this crazy, weird idea that was from a century ago, but it's actually something that is very prevalent in our modern lives. So let's get right into that. Firstly, let's get to understand that when somebody says Karl Marx, obviously the first thing that pops into our heads is, oh, you're talking about communism. You're talking about, capitalism is bad. Oh, Karl Marx. That is what we've been trained to see because of the education system, and it's a very biased view because of how history has been taught, how economics has been taught. Karl Marx is kind of thrown in with communism and communist revolutions and all of that. What people really don't understand is that Karl Marx is also a social philosopher. He spent a lot of time with a central question, and this question was the question of alienation. And what do I mean by alienation? It's the idea of feeling separated from who you are, a feeling of, there's something not quite right with who I am and the world outside of me. There is this friction going on, and that is alienation, right? This sense of not being able to make sense of the world that we think and the world that we feel, the world that should be, versus the world that is actually here. It's not matching up. Now, Karl Marx was really influenced by a lot of philosophers that dealt with the same issue, and that led him eventually to critique capitalism. Why? Because capitalism was the best symbol of what went wrong and how far our alienation had gotten. So for an example, during Karl Marx's time, it was around the time of the Industrial Revolution, and he saw firsthand how people more and more were losing sense of community, losing sense of living on the land, being on farms, working together, having that sense of equality and bond with the fellow man. More and more people were being driven into big cities. More and more people were forced into factory jobs because that's all that there was. Those were the only jobs you could get unless you happened to be wealthy. And he noticed more and more how the wealthy people kept getting more and more wealthy, where the poor people kind of kept getting more and more poor. So already there's that disconnect. And because he already had this sense of question, alienation, he developed more and more the social theories, and that eventually became, his Communist Manifesto that he wrote, a partner of his. But to get back to our point of discussion today, it is the subject of the false consciousness. The false consciousness is the idea that individuals are the ones to be blamed when the social order and society itself actually is unfair. For example, in modern times, when somebody says they're stressed out because of all the work that they're doing and all the hours they're putting in and how little time they spend with their families or how little time they have to develop their own interests or hobbies, what do people say? Oh, well, you must be depressed. You should go on antidepressants. You should go on this medication, these pills, and you should watch these self-help videos, and they're going to make you a better worker. You're going to learn how to cope with all of that, because that's not normal. The field things, you're supposed to be able to work 70 hours a week because that's normal, right? So that is a kind of false consciousness. where we so lose touch with ourselves. We so lose touch with who we are because of having to function in a society, in a world system that is messed up, that doesn't regard us. So before I go into more of that, I'd like to get kind of your feedback and see if that was a clear enough description of the topic, and if you had anything to contribute to that, Joanna.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. Yeah, it was very clear. I appreciate that. And this topic, Sonny, because when I was studying about it, I could see this as a pattern that we can straight away see in our society, even though we may have the latest iPhone or we are connected to the world, there are still things that we seem to be stuck in, such as our self-motivation or lack of it, or having to do certain jobs because we need the money for it and we actually don't express ourselves. Our creativity is really low. We don't feel that we are reaching our fullest potential. And then this just moves on, and then you have a family, and then that pattern will come back even after you come back from holidays. Now that it's September, and you feel that low again. And what I found throughout my life was that, okay, I can see that. However, do I need to participate in that? Do I need to become so in this bubble of feeling as hopeless and powerless towards the system that existed before I was born? So there seems to be, when I was analyzing this topic, there's like a dual dimension to that, which is, on one hand, is what can I do as an individual in order to not participate in that false consciousness that I don't own my life, but at the same time, how can the system change out there, here in the world, political, social, economically, so that I am entitled to that self-expression, to that creativity, to that expansion of my being. So that has been something like raised many questions as to what am I doing here? Is that what I do really expressing myself, or do I actually define me as what I do, as my task, as my job? And to answer to some of those questions, I found that it is a mental state. First, like, it is my relationship to what I do, but also the society where we live. And I found that there was a lot of, especially like here in London, you see all this like publicity and selling, like, your life will be better with this, or this is what you have to be happy. And it's about consumerism and how we think that we can buy that happiness, but in the end, it doesn't happen. It has to be from within. And that's this lack of culture of life itself, of actually what is to be alive in this world. What can I do to help me and help society? And once I solved this inner kind of hole that we could all go into, I kind of start seeing, okay, if I actually help myself to put my well-being in first place, then whatever I do in society, whatever company I work with or for, or that I establish, those principles will be taken into account. And eventually that will be part of solutions that have to be entered more at a global level, where everyone actually contributes towards the well-being of everyone. And we realize that what we're doing here is actually to live. We're not here to die or to live in poverty that simply limits our options to reach our fullest potential. So that was, like, in a nutshell, what was my relationship with this topic. And it was really helpful to understand how it came about, how, like, the past, the industrial revolution, and seeing that even today we are not free from enslavement. There's still the same pattern, but it's just covered and really well dressed with really bright colors for us to, that this is the way it has to be. And things that we're going to talk in this hangout is alternatives that are already being implemented, and other solutions that must be implemented as soon as possible, so that we can actually make life on Earth much more gratifying, and like that we are actually enable us to prepare a society where each and every single being that are born from this moment on, they have the infrastructures and the tools to realize themselves as human beings and individuals. So that has been my idea about this topic. And one thing that I wanted to perhaps touch upon was this idea, Joe, when the belief that who is poor was born poor and will always be poor, and they don't deserve to be happy, or they don't deserve to have more, and this is also false consciousness, and people kind of blame themselves for not having enough, or not being enough, or good enough. And then on the other hand, you have the wealthier layers of society where they do believe that they also deserve the best, and people use God to say, yeah, they are blessed and the others aren't, or they simply done something wrong and they're being punished for being poor. So on these concepts, how far have we gone into kind of personalizing the injustice that exists in the world to simply justify it?
So there's so many dimensions to this subject. I think the best way to go forward is to break down a little bit more what Marx was talking about in terms of false consciousness and the dimensions of what he calls alienation. And I'm going to break that down a bit and be able to relate that to modern day. And from there, we can look at, how do we tangibly deal with something like this? So let me rewind very briefly. So when Marx talking about false consciousness, why is it false consciousness? It's false consciousness because, according to Marx, and this is not me saying I'm a Marxist, this was right. This is just looking at something that he put out as an idea that I want us all to kind of explore, okay? The idea being, false consciousness is false because it blinds you to the fact that it's not just you living in an unfair system. It's not just you alone being exploited, having to put your labor into something that you really aren't the beneficiary of. At most, you maybe get a paycheck. Maybe you can, survive and get by. And that shouldn't be the totality of who you are, or what you spend your time on, right? That isn't life. That isn't living. Now, it's false consciousness when we go into this idea that it's just us, or that there's nothing we can do about it. His solution was to develop the opposite, which is class consciousness, which is understanding that you're part of a class structure. And when you have that understanding, you realize, hey, we're all in this together. None of us are actually happy. None of us are actually feeling fulfilled. And from that premise, his idea was that once people really understood this and the common ground we all have, that is when things can turn around. That is what he called the proletariat revolution. It wasn't about people being violent or overthrowing. It was because the proletariat, the working class, are the most alienated people. And when they realize how alienated they've been, there's going to be that urge to, well, according to Marx, bond together and realize, hey, together we can solve this. We couldn't do it alone. That's why it never changed.
Like a wake-up call.
Yes, right? So with that kind of understanding, we can move forward to modern day. Now, there are four main dimensions of alienation that Marx touched upon. The first is alienation from work, okay? During his time, people were alienated from work because they were working factories and they were making little parts or pieces, and none of them were attached to their work in a meaningful or personal way, right? It was just a job. They had for money, for survival, barely even surviving at that. So is there really any personal enjoyment or investment in being the best at that? No. So first layer is alienation from work, right? Second layer, alienation from the production, the activity of production. Are those people personally happy making those parts, making those little things for, 12, 13, 14, 15 hours a day? Are they expressing themselves? Are they happy doing that? Is that honoring who they are as a human being? No, of course not. So that's another layer of alienation. A third layer would be, and this is one of the more important ones, alienation from what he calls species being. Let me word that so we can understand it better in regular terms. He's basically talking about separating yourself from yourself. It's talking about how human beings become separate from what it means to be alive. And that becomes replaced with what we have to do to maintain a living. And that's not the same as being alive. So that's where that idea of consciousness comes in. We are replaced with a consciousness of, I have to wake up and go to work and make my living and get my paycheck and have enough money so that I can survive, because that's the way the world works. And that is your consciousness. And you build your whole life around that. And you don't question anymore. You more and more, you lose yourself to that, and you become detached from what it means to wake up, what it means to breathe, to be in your own body, to move yourself. So that's separation and alienation from yourself. And the fourth and final element of alienation that Marx used to talk about was alienation from each other, right? And during those times, people had no, it wasn't in your interest to help other people, because you had to compete for positions, for work, even if it's just a factory job, and you have to spend 20 a day there and live in a shack because that's all that you could afford. That's all there was. And you needed that for yourself to survive. And more we saw alienated people from their own families, from their own co-workers. Everybody became a competitor. Now, this was way back during Marx's time, right? He talked about all of these things. Now, let me ask all of us now, honestly, when we look at the world today, has anything actually changed? Or has everything gotten actually worse and more sophisticated to a point where it's so pervasive that we kind of lost track of how detached we are from everything, from ourselves, from our work, from what we do at our jobs, and from each other? I mean, yes, our material conditions may have been how they were in the Industrial Revolution, but is the quality of life, of living, actually better? And that is the heart of the false consciousness in modern times. So before we go any further than that, what's your perspective on that, Joanna?
Well, Joe, I think that was a great explanation of the various different layers within this false consciousness and alienation that in modern days, I mean, as you were speaking, I could definitely see that reflected in today's society, just a different kind of a new page in history, but very similar. And it is interesting to say to see that even our relationship to time seems to have changed. Like now it seems that we don't have time to do anything that we really enjoy, or when we're actually doing things that we enjoy, time flies by and we don't see it, and suddenly we're back on something that we may not enjoy that much, but we simply got into this flow of having to do it, the have to, instead of actually wanting to and growing with. So and all of that is kind of we don't see even in school, for example, having that education when things, they don't have to be this way. This is how they are right now. This is how they have been. But it's not a law that this has to be. I mean, laws are in place because we accepted them in first place. So so it was mainly that relationship to work and to time that has changed, and obviously then the relationship to ourselves. And one thing, or just another thing to add on that, was in the past was when they were doing, and today, those routine jobs where you have to put a piece and that's all you do, so you don't see the bigger picture. And that is something that there seems to be like a transition, especially like with technology, where people can see what my contribution is to the global picture. However, this is not still the case for many jobs that still exist in this world, that it's simply to feed the system as it is. Like, people need the money and they will do those jobs, but in the end, they don't feel as if they are contributing at all to the betterment of themselves and to the society around them. And that will be a reflection also in the dynamics. And as you mentioned, in terms of competition, that is, these days I see that that's kind of, it's a bit hidden. It's still there. People are kind of accepted instead of actually saying, hey, wait a second, we really need to behave this way. We really need to fight for a position if in fact that position, it doesn't make sense. There is no need to have that job, but just the purpose is to pay bills. So there's like lots of kind of questions, and the fact that we think, oh, what will be the answer, what will be the solutions, and they can't be implemented right now because it's kind of on a global scale that has to change. But it will be nice to then talk about what each one of us can do already in order to step aside and to see things as they are, and not being illusioned by, even if you think you have the best lifestyle in the world, if you look it closer, you are lying to yourself, because it's not yet the case. Being aware of us, but also the world around us, and things are not as they need to be. Well, while I was just talking, I see that Kelly just joined us. So it'll be nice
Hi there.
to see. Hey, Kelly. So Kelly is from Seattle. So during this first part of our presentation, we introduced the concepts. We went through the historical background of the concept of false consciousness, and now we're moving it to the false consciousness in modern days. Um, so perhaps what I will do is, Joku, do you want to lead in terms of seeing what the next part of the presentation will be, and then Kelly, will be great to have your feedback as well.
Sure.
Yeah, and please do jump in anytime. So from here, I'd like to talk about a couple of things. Now that we've covered a little bit of the history and we got to understand the four main dimensions of alienation and how that's still relevant to us, perhaps even more so today than they were back during Marx's time, I want to go into proving that there is a false consciousness at work for the doubters out there. Prime example, those of us who have a job. You go to work, and automatically you're somebody else. You are not, in fact, you when you're working, are you? Honestly, look at that for a minute. It's uncomfortable, right? It's weird. Who are you? You're not you. When you're on the phone with a client, are you honestly being yourself? Talking to another person as an equal, as a brother, as a sister? No, you're talking as somebody with a job to somebody else that you need to convince to buy your product or go with your company or do something to affect a transaction. And while all of that is going on, are you really proud of what you're doing? Maybe some people, but I would say the majority of human beings right now clock out, right? They stop being themselves the minute they clock in work. How is that not a false consciousness? How is that not you not living yourself? How is that not you betraying that essence of who you are, and by extension, how is that not you in a way lying to other people when you're on the clock? So this argument of false consciousness, it really, it's not metaphysical, it's not anything crazy, it's how separated we've become from awareness. And exchange for our own awareness, we've replaced it with consciousness. Consciousness being the ideas we have and the personalities we have to be and what I have to do to, make my bill payments and what I have to do at my work. All of that is consciousness. But guess what? None of that is you. And as uncomfortable as that may be, it's the truth. So what do we do with that? Who have we become? What have we let go of? What is the solution? And to illustrate that, I want to tell a brief story, and this is something that happened to me while I was going to high school. Now, this is at a time where, I was living at home, everything was taken care of. I didn't have to work. I was just a high school student. But one day, I decided to learn how to program my calculator because I noticed some of the kids at school could put games onto their calculator, and at math class, we would all be playing games and pretending to be doing math problems. So I thought, that is so cool. So what I did was, I decided to teach myself programming. Now, at that point, I had no experience. I had nobody telling me, hey, that's not what you're good at. You shouldn't focus on that. That's not going to make you money. But I did it anyway because that's what I wanted to do. That was an expression of me, and I taught myself how to program calculators on my own. I got the programming books. I wrote the code myself, testing it, seeing it come to life. That was gratifying. And I wasn't paid for that, and I didn't need to be paid for that, and I ended up creating pretty cool stuff. And that is something that people call flow, which is when you tap into that part of yourself where you're not concerned about survival, when you're not concerned about how much money is this going to make me, when you're fully engaged in being who you are, you do amazing things. You can learn. Your capacity to learn is not limited. It is limited today because of the consciousness we adopt. This idea that I don't have time to do what I love to do. I don't have time to explore new hobbies. My hobbies won't pay me enough. And it's a very dangerous idea because guess what? People that are the most creative, people that are passionate, people that can wake up in the morning and look forward to putting all of themselves into what they do are going to be the most successful. And you can see that in examples of companies that have that kind of model. So this is an argument for, number one, developing that for ourselves. What is your flow? Don't forget that. Develop those elements of yourself where you feel most alive. Don't lose that, and don't exchange that for your job. Yeah, don't quit your job right now. Don't put yourself into jeopardy. But find ways to nurture that of yourself because that's the part of you that's real. That's the part of that you can always come home to when you clock out of work, right? That's who you are. Don't lose that. And you'll find that as you develop that living, that spark, that's going to stay with you, and that's going to affect who you are when you're at work. And so that's the personal aspect of it, right? How do you combat the false consciousness? Well, the solution is restore your awareness. Restore who you are and carry that with you. Now, in terms of the global perspective, the argument is, okay, well, how do we fix this? Obviously, this is an economic issue, political issue, global issue. It's very entrenched, very complicated. How can individuals change that? Well, the solution to that is we have to look at an equal money system, basically, and a money system where we take survival off the table. We provide everybody with the opportunity not to take advantage of not having to work, but giving them the opportunity to not have to worry about survival, at least, and allow individuals to tap into that flow. Now imagine, I was in high school back then, and I was able to teach myself programming in a matter, and I had no limitations on me. And that was a creative force. That was a creative beingness coming out of me because there was no limitation. And if human beings were allowed to tap into that, do you think it makes more economic sense to allow people to live that way, or continue to live in a false consciousness where, our labor isn't to our benefit, we just get a paycheck out of it? If I go to work tomorrow and I help create a car, do I get to bring that piece of the car home? No, I don't. I have no ownership, I have no control, I have no investment, no tie, no personal beingness being shared in my work. So when we realize that this can change, when we realize that we're all kind of in this together and none of us are actually happy and none of us are even being who we are for most of our days, we can come together. We can start making new decisions. It starts with yourself, living and pushing and not allowing that false consciousness to dominate you or who you are. And from there, expressing that, and people will see that. And the more we do that, the more we shift things, the more we make it possible for a discussion like this to happen, like the one that we're having now. And that is part of my contribution to a solution, but please, I'd like your feedback.
Well, I mean, I can definitely relate to that because I myself have explored a lot of different hobbies and things in my life that didn't result in being paid any money. And it was really difficult because I had to spend a lot of time working. So where do you find the time to get into the things you're really passionate about? So, for example, something for me was making clothes was something that I really got into, and crafts and that kind of stuff. And people used to say to me all the time, "Oh, you should make a business out of that. You should, you should sell your stuff. You should make money." And to me, it was like, when I considered what that would mean, like turning it into a business and something I have to do like all day long, all week long, just to make money, and then it kind of became like it wouldn't be an expression of myself. It would just be this kind of cheapening of what it is that I would create, because now I have to mass produce it. And part of what I loved about doing it was that I was able to create things with my own expression, like how I would like to design it, how I would like to create it, and I would have rather shared with other people how they could bring in their own creation and that process for themselves instead of just making it and selling it, So it's like, to me, you could kind of look at it as like maybe that was a hindrance, because we do live in a society currently where you do need to make money, you do need to have a job, and maybe that is something that I could have turned into a job instead of having to go through more menial jobs and low-wage labor that's not very satisfying. But in the end, though, like you're saying, like it's kind of like we have to transform ourselves from within what's here. And even though we're in these jobs where it's not who we are, we have to put on an act, we have to put on a role, we can still within that bring ourselves through within that when we realize, like, okay, well, this is what I have to do for the moment. Okay, but how can I bring myself into this, and what's some creative ways that I can apply myself in this kind of awkward situation, if you will, and kind of bring my expression forth, so that it doesn't just become this sort of like oppressed thing. Because to me, part of the reason that we suppress this awareness of the actuality of the situation is because we don't really want to face it, because it's kind of crappy, and it would be hard to go through it every day realizing like, oh, this is so miserable, so we kind of have to choke it down. But really, a lot of the miserableness is maybe self-created because we're reacting to the situation, instead of looking at, okay, just calmly, practically looking at it like, okay, this is the situation we're in now. What can we do to change that? And while I'm in it, let me see how I can bring forth my expression and my awareness and not get over-stressed about an already kind of stressful situation. And just as a side, it's always kind of amazed me how we can be in like a retail job, for example, and at the end of the day, you would go and you count your till, and it kind of amazes me how like disenfranchised we become from the results of our own labor. Like you were saying, we don't get to take anything home, and it's amazing how you can be counting out all that money that you've just earned with like all your labor, and then you take that money and whoosh, and it goes away, and you just get this little portion of it, and it's really fascinating. And I think there's a deep dynamic there. There's this kind of relationship of separation between, those who say, do get to walk away with the benefits of a business, like the owners, for example, or whomever's at the top, and then the workers at the bottom, and there's this sort of disconnect of those at the top thinking that the ones at the bottom are just lazy, don't want to work, but they're not the ones reaping the benefits. And it's obvious for me to see if I was, if it was my business, I'm sure I would have a different perspective where I would put myself into it more because I'm actually benefiting from it. This is actually resulting in me having a dignified living and having money to do things that I like with. So I'm sure I would be like, hello, how are you today, sir? What would you like to buy? La 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 la. I'm sure I would more happily sing that tune if the results of that effort was going right into my own pockets. So it's kind of an interesting dynamic there that is usually taken for granted when the laborers of society are looked at in a sort of disgruntled way, like, why, you don't want to work anyway, or you're lazy, or, you got to take into consideration that they're not getting the full, compensation for their efforts and labor, so, it's like a self-feeding kind of dichotomy that you have going on there.
Yeah, that's excellent. Joanna, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, that was pretty much, it was really good, Kelly, and I would say that we would actually see that it's a win-win solution. And this far, there's always someone losing at the expense, or someone winning at the expense of someone else. This is this global awareness that has to exist, that as long as there's someone in a very poor, or in a situation, or simply into depression because of the system itself, then there's something that has to be done. So one thing that I will also mention to our audience is that we're going to share some links to our league manifesto and our proposal, as what Joe was mentioning, in a society where actually survival is excluded from the equation of living in this world, and everyone will have the opportunity to experiment what it is to live okay in this earth, and actually have the opportunity and the time to make the best of ourselves and the planet, and everyone else will going to benefit from each one's happiness. One thing that I was going to add here is that there is this, when we get older and we see that time is just passing by, and we kind of forget ourselves, then there is this tendency to project that onto our children, and suddenly children have this massive schedule with lots of activities because they have the time to do it, where in fact it's us as parents that we kind of forgotten ourselves, and we're not giving us that space to continue expanding and investing in our education, in our skills, or anything like physical that we want to do in sports, because that will reflect as who we are, our mood, our relationship to our partners, to our families, to our colleagues, employees, and everybody else. So there is this kind of ripple effect that will create from within to outside that will definitely change society, and also learn with each other. If we are spending 8 hours of our days with colleagues, why don't we get to know each other and actually talking with each other and meeting, and why are we doing this, what is your plans, and how can we contribute? And that has been my attitude throughout these days, and I've met wonderful people around me that have also helped me to grow and to learn, that otherwise, if I didn't have this interest in improving myself and my life and this world, then I would have missed so many opportunities. And then, we have about, a few minutes left, but I wanted to remind everybody that if you have any questions, please feel free to send them or to post comments after this live session, and we'll send you our feedback. Well, guys, do you have any final comments on this session today? We are reaching the end of the Hangout, but it will be good to have your feedback. And in the meantime, I'm just going to put my charger, so please go ahead and share any last thoughts.
Kelly, do you want to wrap up first before I cap it off?
Let's see. Well, I would say that, like Joanna was saying, she was making a really good point about kind of that transforming those relationships in your workplace, and where you might have missed some things if you weren't, taking that approach. And I can definitely second that, because, having done a lot of jobs that were, low-paid jobs, not really any kind of fun or expression within it. And if you go into it and you become disgruntled, nothing's going to come out of it. You're kind of guaranteeing that nothing's going to come out of it. You're not going to get anything out of it. And at some point I realized that, there used to be this kind of vibe, like, why am I going to work? I'm just getting paid so little anyway. Why am I going to, care? I'm going to do as little as I possibly can. And what I found was that this was essentially kind of making me lazy and tired and disgruntled, and none of that was pleasant. And then if I did have something that I actually wanted to do, I still felt lazy and tired and disgruntled. It carried over. And so I decided that, I don't care how little I'm getting paid and how crappy this job is. It doesn't help me to just kind of go into that and mope about it and make it even worse. It's actually harming me later when I go out and I want to do something that I like to do, because that's what I'm living, and that's what I'm becoming, is that laziness and that disgruntledness and that dejectedness. So instead, I decided that, I don't care if I'm not getting paid enough to work hard or whatever. I'm going to do it for me, because it's my own benefit to, not be lazy and not be grumpy and grouchy and, and bitchy and moany, and, and it's to my benefit to consider what would I really like to be without any of those parameters that apparently have to determine how much of myself I can put into something. So, and, since living that, and also the point of bringing through an awareness and interacting more with the people who I'm finding myself working with, same as with Joanna, it's opened up so many new conversations and relationships, that wouldn't have happened before, and where we've actually can talk about things like the status quo and the current situation, and, help each other to show, like, it's okay to talk about these things, it's okay to question the way things are, and it's okay to consider new ways that we can do things and solutions and how things could be different, and also how to not get angry at the situation. So, yeah.
Awesome. We are coming up to the end of our show today. This has been a really cool hangout. We discussed quite a bit. Just to summarize what we talked about today, we went into a little bit of the history of Karl Marx and his theories about class consciousness and false consciousness. We talked about the degrees of alienation that happened during his time and how they'll apply to us here today. We talked about some solutions that we can bring in where we start changing our own relationships to who we are when we have, kind of slip into that false consciousness for survival. How do we not lose ourselves in that, but to retain who we are and our creativity and our self-meaning? And how we can start by, like the examples brought up today, opening up to yourself and to other people, and making it okay to yourself to ask these questions, and from there making it okay for other people to join that discussion with you. Start shifting the way we look at things, and being the example. That change is such a critical step. We also look at how, on a global scale, the more we start realizing that there are alternatives and that there is a false consciousness at work that's limiting us, and that it's actually a much wiser choice for all of us when we're allowed to live without the fear of survival, when we change the economic system based on a collective agreement that, hey, we can actually create cooler stuff when we work together and not have to worry about money all the time. When that starts to shift, guess what? We can change the world, and it all starts with conversations like these. And with that, I thank you for joining this discussion, and I look forward to many more. Do look for us again on our next Politics of Self Hangout. And with that, I thank you.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
See you next time.